Greetings, you joyously miserable accursed. It's Herle here with Reid, Teneycke, and Leichnitz. None of us are very happy today. I've got good reasons. Jordan has good reasons. We'll hear what the others are. The political panel, whose banter is worthy of its audience. Funny, top shelf, hope and solace providing in this dystopian time. These are direct quotes from our always insightful YouTube commentariat. Scott, I reckon this is the first time you've ever been told that you are hope and solace providing.
They were talking about me.
To check the
I don't
sources
think
on that.
I don't think that comment was directed toward me. I remember mine having something to do with eating and dicks.
Yeah. You know, my Nespresso machine broke this morning.
Oh fuck, that's
Are
bad.
you one of these
My
people?
condolences.
Jesus, we're just talking about the zombie apocalypse off mic, and now Hurley's like, "Oh, I can't possibly suffer through the Gatineau wilds without my Nespresso machine." You are
I-
soft as a bag of yogurt, you fucking pathetic modern man.
Well, I would have made you up a special latte or something with the
It's
with the
okay.
old school rocket here.
You can use dandelion roots, David, if you're really
Exactly.
in a pinch.
Boil
You're
some
That's
water
it.
and
just roast them.
Some pine needles,
Yeah, you'll
there
be
you
fine.
go.
ward off the scurvy.
I'll pull something together. Yeah. Jordan, you're sick.
I'm sick. I'm always sick because small children. Yeah.
Yeah. You actually sounded today, though.
Yes. I think maybe you guys have had the same experience, but I feel like by the time spring arrives, like all of my sort of endurance and resistance is just gone. I'm just, it's been a long winter.
Yeah.
Yeah,
In
well,
case you're wondering out there, this is a direct fuck you to the people who claim not to like our pre-show banter.
Yeah,
That's
this
right.
banter's great.
There is
Some
no show
relatable
today.
banter.
It's just banter.
right.
In a minute, we're going to talk about experiences at the drive-thru. So settle in, listeners.
Actually, what we are going to do is look back on last week's First Minister's meeting and take a look at the breakneck Carney agenda and see how that's going to play out politically, including the upcoming G7 meeting. We're also going to take a look at our cursed clipping, which is from Kelly McParland writing in the National Post that Pierre Poilievre needs to face a leadership review to earn the right to stay on as conservative leader. We'll end with Gordon Pinsent, as we always do. Kory, how are you, brother?
Good. I'm not sick, but man, the smoke and the allergies don't mix. So I sound a little hoarse, but it's okay. I'm not sick.
Excellent. Good to hear. Well, you're the person I want to hear from first on this. So, the pace and the substance of the Carney agenda so far is takes you aback a little bit because, like, as we are recording today now, we understand that there's going to be a new defense policy announced, which will be radically different from the old defense policy. It's going to get us to 2% this very year and up to 3.5% in a few years. We had the first minister's meeting last week, and then we had the introduction of the legislation that is to get all this, all these projects built. Not surprisingly, there are some people who have views about that legislation and about those projects. So all of this stuff is rolling out really fast, Kory, and first of all, without some of the political massaging that you might normally see. There's not much preconditioning done for these things. This defense announcement comes out of the blue. There's not a lot of preconditioning done for these things, and a lot of them have, pretty solid built-in opponents. Like, there's a reason why defense spending has not been high in this country. It's because most people don't support spending money on it. So, what do you make of how he's rolling all this stuff out? Let's just start there.
Well, personally, I'm quite happy about it. We've had a lot of conversations about all of these things, but in terms of preconditioning, what do you think the federal election was about? Like you had,
I don't know if it was about defense spending, but
well, you saw even the Trudeau government change its tune on defense spending and speed of defense spending in its dying days, and change it quite radically. Like, so, and does anyone think the conservatives would do it even slower? They probably think no, they wouldn't, and maybe they wouldn't, but they were promising to do it slower. Like,
Yeah.
if you look at what the gap in the spending between the liberal platform and the conservative platform, a lot of it is actually could be ascribed to that area if you chose to highlight it in that way. Uh, but look, I think this is long overdue. We've talked about it many times on this show. Like the cost of not living up to your NATO commitments is bad relations with every other NATO country currently. It used to just be bad relations with the United States, but when everyone else is going there, and some like those most at threat are talking about going to 5%. It really is a big change. Like this is Starmer, this is Germany, this is everyone else, right? So I don't think there's a choice. If you want to be a part of the Western Alliance, then you've got to do your bit. And the price of not doing that is going to be bad relations with everybody else. But this notions we've talked about before of I'm going to get really offended about being called the 51st state, and then I'm going to do none of the fucking things that real countries do when it comes to defending its borders and being a responsible international actor. So, anxiously await what gets announced today. It's way overdue. I'm glad they're doing it. On the projects, like there is a lot more commonality in that area, even than in the defense area, where there already is a lot of overlap with the conservatives. Yeah, they're both talking about essentially the same thing with resource corridors and faster approvals and 85% of the Canadian public voted for that. So when you say, no preconditioning, I think the election campaign preconditioned the hell out of that notion. And, add into that, we've had 5 provincial elections in the last year, in which these issues have been very much in the fore in many of those. But extend beyond that to the First Minister's meetings, of which there have been a number, and Premier's Council of Federation meetings, of which there have been a number. And everyone's on that same page, whether they're, NDP or conservative or the last few liberals left at the provincial level. There's a lot of consensus there. So I think it's reading the mood of the country correctly. I guess the question will be, does that consensus break down because of some of the underlying factors that you mentioned, David, where there are natural opponents to some of these things? Does that outpace the reform in a way that's reminiscent of the constitutional wrangling of the 90s in late 80s where you see other changes in government and you see people starting to get unelected at the provincial level because of some of these things, and consensus just sort of falls away before the actual reform has happened. I think that's the case. So like I think it's reading the room right now. I think it's the right thing to do overall. But the speed is important in order to get this done before that consensus erodes.
We're expediting nation-building projects. That's a quote and the optimistic path forward from last week's First Ministers' meeting held by Prime Minister Carney. To quickly build infrastructure that makes Canada the strongest economy in the G7. A climate for investment if I've ever heard one. The presenting sponsor of this podcast, TELUS, is doing more than applauding the ambition from the sideline. They're bellying up to the investment bar with a rather astounding $70 billion in network infrastructure and operations, all of it committed over the next 5 years. Their goal is only this: the transformation of our country's digital landscape. To nation build, as it were, a more connected, innovative, and competitive Canada. Over the next few weeks here in this space, I'm going to dive into the whole story in some detail. How TELUS is building cutting-edge new infrastructure from coast to coast. How they're fostering innovation and leadership in artificial intelligence, championing sustainability, and breaking down outdated barriers to competition to lower prices for customers. Whether you're a tech nerd, a business leader, a politico, or simply an engaged, proud Canadian, this is the story of how one homegrown company is choosing to co-sign onto our country's potential to the tune of $70 billion. And if you think all of that is somehow unremarkable, because all telcos in Canada must be lining up to invest in nation building like TELUS, think again. Some of the other Canadian telecom companies have cut their Canadian capital expenditures in favor of US market expansion. So I guess you could say they're building, but it's happening mainly in another nation. Spicy, and more to come on all of this next week.
I think we live in the only times, meaning we can only do this stuff if we do it right away. Like that, I think that this word crisis that envelops us and has since, Trump announced his trade aggressions and that directed and determined the outcome of the campaign. Carney regards him, no crisis, no Carney, like all of this. I think we're in the only times. I think you can only, and I think Carney recognizes that you can only move on things this significant and this swiftly because of the sense of crisis, and the correlation to that, the corresponding factor there is if you don't move swiftly, that consensus can dissipate, and all of those entrenched interests that we're talking about will grow more powerful, and it would become harder to do these things. And so I think we live in a period where we can only do this now, and that's why he's doing so much so swiftly. It isn't just that we're having a defense announcement today because there's a G7 on Sunday, but really we're going to look back on this in the way that you and I look back on the deficit, right, David? Which is that, people often say to you and me, they'll take us for drinks and they'll go, Jesus, why can't we get government that will go after and be fiscally responsible in the way that you guys were? And it's like, because that was the only period in Canadian history where the public gave a government permission to do it. This, I think Carney recognizes, this might be the only time that you could actually jack defense spending by that much and not have people say, wait a goddamn minute. If we're going to make that many billions, tens of billions of dollars of commitment, I think I'd prefer that it go to healthcare first. And so I think that's why we're seeing it. I'll just add one or two quick asterisks. I know there's plenty to do on defense. And Kory talks about our G7 obligations and all of that. I also know that we should be concerned about what happens when a bunch of DGs sitting at their desks suddenly have an enormous sack of cash dumped on their table, and they are told to find ways to spend it because there is a target for spending and it must be done. And just making certain that the system is structured so that it not just only receives this money and not just spends this money, but that it does it in a way that's productive and in a way that makes sense. Because when you put this much money through the garden hose of government, you're going to get some odd outcomes. And so I think that's something for future watch. I predict that sins will get committed. The second and last thing I would add, just other quick thing, is other things happen in situations like this too, when Carney is demanding, both because of the circumstance and because I think of his nature as a top-down, hey, I'm in charge leader. Like, did the public service just become flawless all of a sudden? My guess is not. This borders bill, right? I think it's probably necessary because it's a condition of these trade talks that appear to be quietly, and sometimes thanks, American ambassador, you seem to be a bull in the China shop, not so quietly, underway. So I suspect we had to do this in order to foster goodwill and move and demonstrate muscular movement on that front as part of whatever's happening there, whether something does or does not come together, who knows, with Donald Trump. But there is an air of impatience. We don't have time to fuck around. Just vote for this and shut up. It's a good idea. And maybe a lot of these things are good ideas. But I'll tell you, man, there's going to be a bunch of broken, screwed up clauses in legislation drafted that swiftly, that rapidly. And, it's probably not going to get the level of scrutiny and review that it requires. And maybe that's part of being in the only time. So I was in the PMO, I'd be pushing on the gas pedal too. But these are not insignificant things we're talking about when we're saying, all right, we're giving ourselves the ability to just kind of trample on past people's rights and privileges and due process and so forth. And I hope at some point people are taking a good hard look at this stuff. So we're moving fast, and that's good. But boy, people, when you move fast, a lot of things get stepped on.
Jordan, do you have a lozenge in your mouth, or can you talk?
No, I can talk. And I think
Okay,
what,
well, I have a question. I
yeah,
have a
okay.
setup question for you, if you can talk, which is so interesting that Scott raises the 95 budget. Because when I look at this situation, the situation in 1995 was you had a liberal government um, doing things that conservatives previously had promised to do but had not been able to do, in part because of opposition from the Liberal Party. Um, and the Liberals were doing it. There were no New Democrats in the House of Commons. They'd been wiped out. There's no opposition from the NDP. The official opposition is urging the government to go faster than it
Mhm.
is going on all of the measures. That feels to me to accurately describe today as well as it describes 1995. And it seems to me that a lot of the opposition that might have in other circumstances been ginned up around the 95, 96 budgets never happened out of civil society because there was not a political expression of that opposition. So is that the same situation we are in today?
Yeah, I think it's a real danger. And actually this is something that some New Democrats talked about during the campaign as a risk, was exactly a repetition of that dynamic from 1995, where you do get the the only strong opposition voice in Parliament urging that the government to go faster, cut deeper, and do all of those things that are that, like we're still living in the problems, some of them that were caused by the 1995 cuts, right? When you look at things like the housing crisis or the homelessness crisis, like there's a lot of things that can be traced back to that. And so, yeah, I think that's a huge danger. And I think that the border bill that Scott brought up is an excellent example of this. There's a ton of stuff buried in that legislation that actors have been trying to push through for many years. And it's found its home in, and it's found its expression in this piece of legislation, because now it's about trade negotiations. Now it's about ostensibly addressing what's happening and the concerns that Trump has with fentanyl and so on. But it doesn't change the fact that the measures in this bill, of which there are many and that touch on everything from privacy rights to immigration, all kinds of stuff, really do need strong scrutiny. Now, my question is, like, what are the conservatives going to do? They're going to be under a whole lot of pressure to expedite this legislation through. But there's a lot of stuff in here that demands that they do an actual job of official opposition. So we're going to see where they sit on that, whether they're concerned about being viewed as holding this up or whether they're going to actually kind of put their pants on and do the job here. This is a bill that really should be split, going to several different committees and have really lengthy scrutiny and study. And here we have the government talking about getting that passed in the next few weeks. This is going to be, I think, a situation as well where Carney's expectations about the speed at which these things will move through Parliament are going to collide with reality. And I think we've already seen that on interprovincial trade. I don't know if you guys
Or
noticed.
not. Or
Well, I don't
not.
know. Yeah, and that would be a huge failing on the part of the conservatives. And I think that would be, for me, that would ring like a lot of alarm bells. Like the job is to scrutinize, right? That is the role. And if you have, like, you're already seeing, though, Carney, I was going to say, just move the deadline a little bit on the interprovincial straight trade stuff. So now it's no longer Canada Day. It's like we're going to start to lift those things. So reality will eventually collide. But, to your larger point on the resource projects and coming out of the first minister meeting and things like this, look, I think this is the moment of maximum crisis. He is clearly wrapping everything in kind of that wartime rhetoric, and that's going to buy him a lot of goodwill and a lot of support. But this is a very narrow window. And I think things shift significantly by the time we arrive at the fall. So whatever he's not able to do in this short summer session, I think will not pass through so easily in the fall. But there are real problems here. And to go back to the question of preconditioning and the first minister's meeting and expectations, like, we chatted about this. Like, we were all pretty surprised that there wasn't some sort of a list that came out of that meeting, because it had been allowed to get out there and expectations had been created that there would be some form of a list. And the other thing I would say is that when you look at what the projects are that the provinces have put forward, so yes, an oil pipeline is one of them, but it's not the only one. There's lots and lots of other projects from, ports and rail and electricity corridors. There's all kinds of stuff in there. But the public discussion has really boiled down to what is effectively the most complex, the most controversial, and the longest timeline project. And there has been, I think, pretty little effort on the part of Carney and the team around him to steer the conversation to what could be some early wins. So rather than maybe selecting a couple examples off of those submission lists of projects that might actually be lighter lifts that might have more political consensus behind them, and to say, hey, we're going to get, we're getting on these ones right away. The conversation has been allowed to become, are we sort of going to be able to sufficiently please Danielle Smith by getting a pipeline through? And of course, the answer is politically no, right? She's not going to be happy with anything the federal
She's
government.
the only person threatening to
right.
separate at the current time.
Yeah, and so if that is the bar, that's a bar that the federal government is never going to meet. So I'm curious as to how they're going forward, kind of manage those expectations in order to create some sort of a win. Because they're stepping on a lot of toes right now. And it's the last thing I'll just point out. Out of all the conversations that happened around the First Minister's table last week, one that didn't get as much coverage is how fucking pissed First Nations are that they were not involved in any of the consultations around the legislation. They were sent it kind of pro forma afterwards for comment. They have not been brought to the table with this. And again, we've talked about this before. You can have that conversation on the front end, or you can have that conversation on the courts in the back end, but you have to have that conversation. And Carney and his team don't seem to have put in quite the same effort there that they have in that First Minister space. And I think that that's also going to come back to haunt them. And it may even come over the summer.
So a penguin is sitting on a train. Conductor says, "Good morning, stranger. Ticket, please." Penguin says, "I'm actually not here as a passenger. I've been looking for my brother, and I'm told he takes this train to work. I'm wondering if anyone's seen him." Conductor says, "Well, I don't know. What's he look like?" Bada boom. That was a dad joke in honor of Father's Day, suggested by our sponsor, CN. A dad joke is defined as inoffensive and generally delivered in a sincere attempt at humor, knowing it will provoke groans. Dad jokes often rely heavily on puns, or, end with the conductor asking the penguin to describe his brother. Anyway, CN seems really fond of dad jokes. Don't ask me why. The folks there just seem to have a one-track mind. Maybe they just want to let off some steam. But look, I don't want to get off on the wrong track. Politics is the third rail on this podcast, and I can't deny that a little humor in these spots is probably just the ticket. I should have a paper bag over my head. I feel like the unknown comic here. I've got a million of them. Oh, wait, that conductor asking for the ticket in the penguin joke? I mean, you got to hand it to him. Okay, we're almost at the end of the line. Just one more. A grasshopper boards a train. Bartender in the bar car says, "Hey, we have a drink named after you." Grasshopper says, "You have a drink named Rupert?" I'm out of control. I promise I'll never try this again. Wait. A carpenter says to his assistant, "That's my stepladder." I never knew my real ladder. Okay, so I'm out of train puns. Happy Father's Day, dads from CN.
Just if I can respond to a couple of those things, David. Look, I think you're seeing the difference between the political landscape in different provinces and what it looks like in Ottawa play itself out. So the amount of opposition to Bill 5 in Ontario greater than it is in Ottawa. And why do you think that is? It's not because the bills are substantively that different. They're both really aiming to do the same thing, and the timing of them is, almost parallel. Probably would have been even smarter to do it completely parallel, frankly. But the difference of having the opposition be the NDP in Ontario versus having it be the Conservatives in Ottawa is very evident in how that's played out in question period and in media coverage and other things. So I think the political environment is it's demonstrably true what you were positing about the 90s, just in that example alone. With respect to First Nations, I think they're a key part of all of this. But what I think is very different this time around versus past times when these projects have been looked at is the element of First Nations equity ownership. And there was actually quite a bit in both the provincial and federal approach on this that I think is making a lot of First Nations very happy, which is we're going to give you equity stakes in major projects, and we're going to give you the cash up front for those, in which the long-term viability of your communities and the benefits that will accrue for those communities related to large-scale resource and and transmission / pipeline projects is going to be very, very substantial. And you're seeing in a lot of these projects, I'll toot the horn of Ontario on this, and Hydro One in particular, where Tim Hodgson's most recently come from,
Yeah.
is some really big deals done with really significant equity ownership and really significant political support from First Nations. That approach is very different than what we've seen in the past, and I think that's where you're going to see a difference in terms of the amount of political opposition from First Nations and the amount of First Nations that are actually proponents of some of these projects, because they have such a huge stake in the success of them. So anyway, I think there are some differences, but agree with a lot of what you guys said.
The secret of success, by the way, in that approach and the distinctions with the past comes down to lawyers and negotiators, at least in part, because in the past, so often, you get these lawyers and negotiators, and they sort of come from a classical training, and they have a classic deal-making perspective. And their attitude is, okay, we're not going to negotiate against ourselves. So if we're going to have First Nation equity participation, then let's see what they ask for. We'll imagine that we're willing to give 10, but we'll see if we can get away with 5. If they ask for 15, we're going to take them down to 12, right? And the difference is, you know what? We want to create pathway now. So we're going to say, listen, you know what? Fuck it. We're giving you 25. We're offering 25 up front, and we're going to give you the money to purchase that investment.
It's 50. It's 50 in a lot of the transmission projects.
It's right.
Literally
I was being
half.
illustrative.
It's literally half.
So it's it's like kicking all the people out of the room who say, well, guys, let's just slow down here. Like, let's make them fight us for it. Can I add one other thing about last week that I thought was really interesting? And I some people might not think this is important, but I think it's interesting. Coming out of the First Minister's meeting, I realized that Doug Ford doesn't know a goddamn thing about Santa Claus, because he describes Santa as arriving with a full sled and then heading back to the North Pole. And then he would call as if like Santa phones children on Christmas Day and says, listen, Amazon's going to drop off a doll for you in a week. Like, that's not how it works. You send in your letter, and then Santa arrives with a full sled and empties it into your chimney and under your tree. So I think, Kory, you got some talking to do. He had it was an
but it was because
maybe,
he'd written a letter.
Maybe Santa was holding back to see where Ford was on the naughty or nice list. Like,
totally, he'd written a letter, and Santa had showed up.
Santa was like reserving
with
judgment.
a promissory note, but not
and
a
Santa
actual
fucks off with the
gift.
sled, and he still goes, this is great, I love it. No, you shouldn't love it. Santa's supposed to leave the toy
Santa
behind.
promised to go back and get the fucking toy. That's what he said in the meeting.
All the elves are like, what is going on?
There's a lot of supply chain disruption right now out there, you guys. Like, some of the stuff is hung up in container ships off the coast right now. A lot of disruption in the supply chain, even up north.
I want to throw a change up into a venerable idiom. The proof is in the pudding, as the saying goes, meaning the value, quality, or truth of a thing must be judged on our direct experience with it, or its results. So here's my change up, friends. I say with no hesitation or reservation, the proof is in the CANDO reactor. Yes, CANDO is our newest podcast sponsor, but I'm a data guy, and facts are facts. CANDO, designed by Canadians, built by Canadians, has been providing reliable, tested, carbon-neutral energy to Ontario since the early 1970s. There are now 16 CANDO reactors operating flawlessly in the province. More truth. In 2016, Ontario began a major program to refurbish 10 of its larger CANDOs. Total estimated cost, $26 billion. Timeline, 15 years to completion. These refurbishments are incredibly complex operations. The core is thoroughly dismantled and then rebuilt, taking about 3 years per reactor. The program is now 2/3 done, exactly on time, exactly on budget. Even more impressive when you consider the whole thing stayed on track through the massive disruptions of the COVID pandemic. That success is only possible because of the strength of the entire Ontario can-do ecosystem. 250 companies and 80,000 employees that make up their operator and supply chain in the province. Back to proof, pudding, and can-do. Along with their suppliers and partners, they've demonstrated their all-Canadian technology bona fides for over 60 years now. That, plus the success of the refurbishment projects in Ontario and similar ones in Argentina, Romania, and Korea, show they have the chops to build the next generation large reactors currently being planned, so necessary for our clean energy and economic future. Can-Do Energy is ready to do exactly that in Ontario, across the country, and around the world. All right, I'm going to draw on your international geopolitical expertise, all of you here, because when I watch Carney right now and all these things, I feel like I'm watching a really interesting game being played, some really interesting moves being made, and I'm not sure how to win how to win the game, how the game gets won. But there feels to be a strategy here. So we know really from the U.S. ambassador that he and Trump are talking offline about shit. We know that every day a new person gets invited to the G7 meeting. For what reason, we're not really clear. We know that out of the blue, new defense spending gets announced. It feels to me like there's conversations happening. A lot of it's leading up to the G7, and a lot of them are building blocks for something larger than each of these individual elements. It's kind of exciting.
Yeah.
High wire.
But if you want to take those apart one at a time, I think the learning on the Trump trade file is there's only one person who cuts deals in that White House, and his name is Donald Trump.
Sure.
And you can talk to Leichnitz or others till you're blue in the face, and the chances are that he knows as much or maybe less than you know about where the president's going to land. And the difference being, if you had direct communications with the president, because I think everyone else is guessing or trying to anticipate the president, and he's mercurial, and he is self-contradictory, and he's moody, and he's all kinds of things. But how you get a deal with that guy is direct. And I think we could spend months and months and months talking with White House proxies and get nowhere. And the admission by the ambassador that he doesn't really know what's going on is emblematic of the reality of that White House. And so I think that's smart. And I think what are some of these? It's creating some space for that deal to happen. Like, clearly the NATO stuff has been front of mind, not just for the Trump administration, for every U.S. administration for a very long time. There's a actual real itch to be scratched there, and so it's getting scratched.
And probably Europe too, right?
And Europe too. Well, I think Europe is even more annoyed. I heard, I think it was on and the rest is politics. Conversations with going on in the UK commentariat about Canada being a laggard. So I think those frustrations are they're in many places more than just Washington. In terms of adding other people to the mix, well, I think having India there is pretty important. Like, if really the challenge of our time is containment of China in one way, shape, or form, how do you have that conversation without India being a part of it? Like, there's lots of things to be concerned about with the government in India, and about Modi's targeted assassination of people on Canadian soil, and attempted assassination on U.S. soil, and other things, and electoral interference, and on and on and on. But pretty important trading partner for the beautiful province of Saskatchewan and people on the prairies and other places where their trade is being frustrated. At the same time, their trade is being frustrated with China. So, and if you're going to make iPhones someplace other than China, or assemble them someplace other than China, where is it going to be? It's probably going to be in India. So, you've got to have these folks around the table. I think it's smart to bring them there because I think it dilutes the influence of or put some guardrails on the US as much as that's even possible in this environment. But I think it's an attempt to do so. And I think it's pretty smart.
Scott, what do you think that Carney's building up to here at the G7 or later? What Meccano set is he trying to put together with all these parts?
The most ambitious possible thing you can imagine. I literally think that. I mean, look, if you sit back in Canada and you fret, as we have since our creation as a country, how can Canada punch above its weight on the world stage? How can we? Why aren't we? Like, we're in the G7, but is that just at the indulgence of the other G7 members? Like, how do we? Well, you can have the biggest economy. We don't. You can have the biggest military. We don't. Or you get the best and brightest leader. Hey, maybe we do all of a sudden. And so I really think, and Carney has all the confidence in the world. So this is where I get infected by Big Daddy-itis, because I look at what's happening and I really do see some threads coming together. Now, I have no idea. First of all, I lack the sophistication and intellectual horsepower to truly well and analyze it. And certainly I lack the ability to peer into the future and to see how likely its success is. But when I look at his chairmanship of the G7, I see a leader who, in a very short period of time, is trying to use this event to, on the one hand, respond to a world that's being reshaped by America's determination to withdraw militarily and economically from its post-World War II role, right? It's decided it doesn't want to be the hegemon anymore. It still wants to be called the greatest, but doesn't want to fucking do any of the things that are required to actually maintain that title. And secondly, in addition to responding to that on the world, it wants to...
Late 70s Ali.
Exactly. And then it very much. Yeah. Punch him with Leon Spinks. And then advance, obviously, some sort of reknitting of our economic relationship, establish some stability or at least diminish our vulnerability on a bilateral trade arrangement, security arrangement with the United States. So how can you sort of do these two things together? So just to pick up on Kory's example, I know, like, this is again where I just delegate. Like, I go like, wow, Modi, isn't it really early to be bringing that guy in? Doesn't that look bad? But then I'm like, I feel like I have to defer my trust and delegate my trust to him and go, he's smarter than I am. And I think he's trying to send a signal that works well. If you have Modi, and here's where maybe it either an addition or in contradiction to Kory, I actually think also initiating what's else happened in the last 10 days. We hear that phone calls have been placed to Xi, that he's initiating contact and opening up further discussions with China. I think a lot of this is, it makes sense in terms of a leadership role, in terms of the G7 and geopolitics. But I also think it plays a role in terms of if we're having secret bilateral negotiations, aren't so secret because the new ambassador of the United States is a fucking cement head, then isn't it smart for us to be saying, look, if the way the world's going to work, Trump and those around him, whether you want to realize it now or a year from now, is that if you're going to withdraw from the world, you're going to drive even your closest allies into a closer orbit with India and China. That is an inevitability, because you got to fish where the fish are. You got to trade where the buyers are. And that means big nations. And so we're inviting them. I think it's leverage in some ways. It works in terms of the geopolitical G7 agenda, but I think it probably really works in terms of placing a certain degree of pressure on those trade talks with the United States, because it's like, look, we're not going to just sit here and suffer. Oh, and then you're going to suddenly, unpredictably in the middle of it, because you're a fucking lunatic, increase tariffs on trade on steel and aluminum. All right, you're making it tough on me, but I'm Big Daddy, so I can take that punch, and I'm not going to respond to the near-term and immediate demand for tariff increase. We're going to get through the G7 and see. We're going to have a few more days of these bilateral talks, and we'll get through the G7 and see. Because I think he's hoping that those levers will unlock some room and some space in those trade talks. I like, there is a game of risk happening here that is too sophisticated for me to see, but I'm confident it's occurring. And I guess I'd rather have him in charge than anybody else. I'm guessing Jordan doesn't have the same confidence, as willing to delegate the same
I was just admiring
Things
the big
license.
daddy love. I was like, it's working for you, which is
It sure is.
interesting.
Yeah, it scares me. Don't get me
Well,
wrong.
his
Like I still
confidence
worry about that
inspiring.
border vote.
I would say I mean, his confidence inspiring in that he seems so strongly to believe in himself and to believe that he's moving
Sure.
towards some path that at the moment it's kind of fun to go along on that ride. Let's consider hair scrunchies. While not all your political panelists may have the long locks needed for a scrunchie, for one Canadian, they have turned into a small business empire. Meet Tina Nguyen, who started XXL and Company in 2019 in Belleville, Ontario, with one oversized scrunchie made from an old shirt. It was a Christmas gift for her cousin, and when that cousin posted it online, Tina's life changed. Fast forward to today. Her TikTok-fueled business has gone from her parents' front coat closet to a 4,000 square foot warehouse in Belleville and a full-time staff of 8. Her XXL scrunchies have sold out, reached a global customer base, and even landed her a spot on Dragon's Den. All thanks to the power of TikTok. Tina's posts are raw, real, and relentlessly helpful. Her weekly Small Business Sunday series shines a light on other entrepreneurs because, as she says, I remember what it was like when I started out. But here's the catch. The last federal government ordered TikTok to shut down its Canadian offices, putting the teams who support businesses like Tina's at risk, along with hundreds of Canadian jobs. With the new government in Ottawa, we've got a shot to keep TikTok Canada working for creators like Tina. Because Canadians aren't just scrolling. We're building global brands, one scrunchie at a time. Jordan, I have to say, I prefer a virtuous, morally virtuous foreign policy to a real politic foreign policy. It feels better to me. But I don't have any canola to sell to anybody.
Sure.
So,
Well, I'm going to give you a mix because I think I too like a morally virtuous foreign policy, but I also think it should be effective. And I think there's a few holes that can be poked in this approach. And just about what you were saying, Scott, about the strategy, and I think a lot of the things you said, I think they're very plausibly true about the table that Carney is setting in terms of putting pressure on the Americans and this, that, and the other. But I also think that there's maybe a simpler strategic explanation around what the pieces that they're pulling together for the G7, and that dilution is the solution to pollution. Like you're bringing Trump, but now you're bringing all these other elements in as well. You're creating some other spaces for different wins in case the Trump component of this does not produce the desired outcome within the next week. Because even if they're texting buddies now, there's no guarantee what the outcome is going to be on that. And I think that the relationship that Trump and Carney appear to have right now, again, this is the best it will be. This is the apex of that. And so there's a strong test right now in his ability
February Elon.
Yeah.
And he said he loved him as much as a straight
Loved
man
him.
could love another.
That's it.
Right?
We're in that moment. The bromance
We're in February
is strong.
Elon. Okay.
We're February Elon, right? And I think that the first
what a fucking show that was last week, though.
Yeah.
I mean,
I loved AOC's like the girls are fighting.
It's the best couple
obviously
episodes.
women are too emotional to be in political leadership.
Clearly.
Yeah.
But so look, and to be clear, look, I hope Carney's successful. I hope he manages to, I don't even know, through that text relationship, get a side deal, particularly on the steel tariffs. That's great. I hope that's what happens. But what I would say is at the time in which he can occupy the space that he's currently occupying, particularly around the tariffs, of being passive, of waiting to see in the public-facing component and having these discussions behind closed doors, I think is pretty short. We've already had the announcement now for over a week that these tariffs would be coming. There's a lot of pressure from industry. There's a lot of pressure from labor. There's pressure from the provinces, from Ford, from others to hit back on these. And so the potential of some sort of a carve out through negotiations with Trump, I would say that unless we're starting to see some concrete steps towards that coming out of the G7, that moment, that pressure for Carney is going to become more acute. So I think that this space that he's in right now, and to be clear, I don't think he has a whole lot of choice of being in that space. They have to pursue this opportunity to try to get a side deal. But going to become increasingly uncomfortable. And I would also just say that, like, I think that there's a lot more they could be doing on the communication side here in Canada to mitigate some of that. So, like, again, the Conservatives, we make fun of the sloganeering, but it is also true that, like, it's a pretty big shift from elbows up and they hit us, we're going to hit back to where we are today. We're not seeing really any of that, and people were not walked along through that process. The second thing is, and this is, I've talked about this before, but unemployment, this is a big problem. This is a growing problem. We had our numbers out for May. We're now at a 9-year high outside of COVID. This is getting worse, not getting better. And the attention to that issue domestically in Canada has been sweet fucking all from this government. And that's something that they can do completely apart from what's happening right now with Trump. Like, it is for free for them to put that in the window and do some work on that here in Canada. And they've elected not to do that so far. So that's piece number one. The second piece, I would say, when we look at what's happening, the NATO spending, so the defense announcement today, I think, again, to be really clear, I think Canada needs to spend more on defense. I think that there's strong practical and moral incentives for us to work far more closely with our European allies, particularly when the Americans are being so unpredictable and hostile to us. But there's trade-offs in this, and we're going to see these as time goes on, particularly a scenario where they're trying to pump that much money into, let's be clear, the Department of National Defense, which, is not known for its ability to manage massive contracts flawlessly on short timelines. Okay, so I agree with all of the criticism that it's ripe for problems here. But there's trade-offs to this kind of spending. Like, we're talking in the next year, if we're going to meet the target, that's an additional $15 to $20 billion spend. Okay. So that's a lot of money when you have a government that's also saying that they're going to be fiscally responsible, that they're going to be cutting spending growth. What is the trade-off? And if you look at our allies, so like the UK made,
I could produce a survey tomorrow that would generate 30 things that Canadians would more enthusiastically spend money on.
Totally. And like, there are trade-offs is my point. And like, if you look at our ally, you talked about the UK and their increase in defense spending. Absolutely, they did. They also slashed foreign aid in order to pay for it. And they were pretty clear about that, right? So I think that what are the trade-offs that are going to be for this? And are we going to get into a situation where we're flowing this money out to meet our defense targets, and like chunks of that money is going to Golden Dome, a project that I think Canadians are very, very skeptical of, but maybe that's part of the quid pro quo with the Americans. How does that wear domestically? And what is the communications work that's happening now to set the table for that? I'm not seeing a lot of it. And I think that could be potentially really explosive for this government as they accelerate these timelines so dramatically. Figuring out what those trade-offs are going to be, we're going to know that in the fall with the budget or the fiscal update or wherever the fuck we end up with. But that is going to be a big pain point for this government.
Right, well, we see a string of announcements.
Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
I bet you just a small point. I bet you see we see a string of announcements over the course of the summer and fall from relatively small companies that have some applicability into defense spending that'll be saying, you know what, we could be beneficiaries of the Golden Dome, and the communications kind of narrative will be, beats the living hell out of me whether any of this shit is real or could ever happen, but like, we could be beneficiaries of it here domestically. Me in my little garage, I invented an algorithm that's got a tool on the side of it, and we're gonna like sell this to the Golden Dome. Like, I bet you're gonna see a string of those announcements in order to generate some domestic consensus.
That's only true if the defense spending comes out of deficit spending. If it replaces existing spending and get into the choices that Jordan's talking about, that's going to be unpopular really quickly. Not necessarily the defense spending, but the other the choices that were made to offset it.
Well, this is the fall. I mean, if you're going to increase spending on housing, you're going to increase spending on defense massively, and if you're going to preserve transfers to individuals and provinces, then like, if you're not on that list,
there's not a lot left to play with.
Like, and if you're going to go from 9 to 2, well, now all of a sudden it's going to feel like you got to go from 9 to -7, and it's going to be like, I don't know how they square that circle.
Well, I have some thoughts on how you square the circle, because I think there's other things going on right now with respect to tariffs and with respect to the consequences for our economy of change in trade with the United States. Look at the tariffs on steel, for instance. Like, what else can you use that steel for that is now being priced out of the U.S. market? Shipbuilding comes to mind. Pipelines come to mind. I think there's a case to
That
front end
doesn't balance
load.
your budget. That's
Yeah,
all
but
Well,
massive
like,
no,
public
it
sector
doesn't
and it
balance
spending.
your,
doesn't
it
replace
doesn't.
the US as an
All
export
right,
market if you allow these
let
tariffs to
me
stand.
finish talking before you start arguing with me. Uh, there are a bunch of choices related to these major
Your
projects.
partial arguments are easier to rebut than your full arguments, John.
Right.
Let's
I
see.
find
Let's see if that's true.
it's a very short rope I have here. Um, uh, Look, we're going to we've got some very bad choices with our steel mills. Do we basically let them partially or fully shut down, or some of them shut down, or what does that look like? But it looks really ugly. And just get rid of our capacity to produce steel, or do we look at the things that we are going to now need steel within our own market, and start, warehousing some of that material for these major projects? Do we start looking at within our manufacturing base, if we are losing some people who are making auto parts, do you stop producing pistons and start producing valves for nuclear power plants that you're going to build? Like, there are ways to transition and retool your manufacturing base to produce things that you're going to be building. And there's ways of doing that. I think that it is a much cleaner baton pass between what those workers and industries were doing, and what in the past, and what they're going to be doing going forward, and they're related to these things. So moving quickly on these major initiatives and defense spending creates an opportunity for those affected firms to produce things for these major national projects. And so going fast, I think, is helpful in that. And I think it's better than spending the money on EI. I think it's better than spending the money on transitioning workers, from a job to, just retraining, not doing something else. So I think these things are all tied together in various ways, and I think there's an opportunity in some of that spending to get something for it, whether it's and maybe something that's more aligned with what our trade's going to look like going forward.
All right.
Yeah.
More on the Kearney bait and switch in future episodes, but let's go to our clipping. So we have a clipping today. Our clipping today, suggested by Scott Reid, was from Kelly McParland in the National Post, who's writing about Poilievre's future leadership. And here's the excerpt I would highlight for you. The nothing to see here case goes like this. In any previous election dating back 40 years, the Tory results would have put them in power, likely with a majority. The fact this one didn't was the result of unprecedented exterior factors, specifically the timing of Justin Trudeau's departure and the coinciding emergence of a U.S. president even his most fervent detractors didn't foresee as being quite this nuts. Alarmed and unnerved, voters opted for continuity and incumbency over the very real practical policies they'd been firmly embracing until then. It's not a bad argument, but also not entirely convincing. In the Liberal bastion of Greater Toronto, it sounds a lot like the local NHL team's annual excuses for once again failing to deliver the goods. The presiding argument for retaining Poilievre as leader is that there's no obvious alternative at the moment. That's not a good place to be. An organization that seeks to govern the affairs of a serious country should be able to muster more than a single leadership option, and it should be any leader's responsibility to see that there's talent in the ranks. Having failed to react successfully to changed circumstances in the last election, Conservatives need time to better prepare for the next one. Poilievre's performance over the next 10 to 12 months will be critical in assessing his suitability to lead those preparations. He should be given time to prove himself, pending a formal review at a party gathering next spring. Requiring as much isn't a knock on Poilievre, but would reflect a party set on deciding its own future. Jordan, do you think this is a live issue in the Conservative Party?
Well, I think that it's certainly a conversation that's happening, but I think the outcome is predetermined. So I think there's a lot of discussion like this occurring, but I don't think anybody really thinks that Poilievre would be pushed out in a leadership review, which is a bit too bad because I think that a lot of the points raised in the
He
article
would be if there was a Poilievre in the caucus, right?
Right. Well, and that's partially the point of the article, right? Is that
Right.
that absence of competition is a large part of what's securing his position. And that's not accidental, of course. Like I think that Polyev and his team were pretty clear about squashing up and coming talent that might have posed a risk to him over the last few years and not showcasing that talent and really making it quite the one-man show. And we saw how that played out. There were pros and cons to that. And I think that Conservative Party members would be wise to decide going forward if that's something that's useful to them. But to me, the question that's most interesting and probably most important going forward about his ability to lead the party potentially into the next election is like, what is his actual adaptability? Like, can he shift? Can he change? Can he adapt to different circumstances? We did not see that capacity during the campaign. And his inability to have any flexibility to react to what was happening was a big part of why they didn't get the result that they were looking for. And look, I mean, I come from a party where we from time to time tell each other lots of really fun fairy tales about why we've lost. And so I recognize that when other parties are doing it as well. And I think that the most dangerous narrative in the Conservative Party right now is this idea that, well, they really won. They really did. They got that popular vote. Like really, it was entirely external circumstances. And if we kind of repeat what we did before, we will be golden.
You know when
Because,
that isn't true? When you show up for work at Monday morning and you're not in a minister's office.
well, that's just it, right?
Right.
Close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. Okay, so this is an example of that. And I would also posit, from my corner, that there were a lot of choices that were made that led to that circumstance that were not imposed by the outside. And I will bring back the absolute ill thought out stupidity of attacking the NDP and relentlessly drawing down the NDP's numbers in the months leading up to the campaign. It's math, folks. You do that, and you are not going to get the vote splits that you need to win. And so, like, there should be interrogation of those choices if you want to have a different outcome next time, even completely apart from whether Pierre Poilievre's personality transplant is a permanent thing or whether he's just putting on a show of contrition for the next few months, which is an important question. But they should be interrogating some of those tactical choices as well. The fact that it was a one-man show and that there's really no up-and-coming talent that could potentially show Canadians who's going to be the front bench for the Conservatives. What's up there? So I think that there's a danger that because the outcome of such a leadership review is a little bit predetermined, that those questions are not going to get asked, which would not be good for them.
Right. Kory, I'm going to let you back clean up on this. I'm going to go to Scott first and say, Scott, one of my formative political experiences is the leadership review in the Liberal Party in 1986 when Turner was being challenged, and I was working on the pro-Turner side. I've seen some of them others go down, but when I think about that one, I think about how important it was that Liberals liked John Turner and that Liberals felt personal affection for John Turner and that Liberals kind of wanted to give him another chance and wanted that election 84 to not have been his fault. And I'm just going to repeat, I'm not a conservative, but I don't sense the same feeling about Poilievre inside the Conservative Party at all about that. To me, it had more in common with the contractual relationship that that Mulcair had with the NDP about, I don't like you, you're not my kind of person, but you're going to win, so I will choose you. Having failed to do that, I don't know how much goodwill there is toward Poilievre. There may be arguments in his favor. There may be still fear of his political organization. But how much goodwill there is toward him, I'd be skeptical.
Yeah, I just don't know the answer to that because I'm not a conservative. I'm not inside that movement. I mean, I think one thing that's missing from that analysis, that sounds right to me. Like, I don't run into a bunch of people who say, I enthusiastically like Pierre Poilievre. And I'm not just talking about Liberals, like conservatives who say that to me. I think there was a contractual deal that, he was supposed to win this election, and maybe it was inevitable that he was going to win this election, and he built this sturdy blitzkrieg force, and so it couldn't be resisted. But I wanted to I wanted to talk about this. Sorry, and I think the element that's missing though is culture. Like to me, I think one of the interesting questions is: let's imagine that Polyev competes the next election and loses it. What would the next leader look like? Usually, leaderships are a response to what occurred prior. I I think there's a culture that's been laid into this party at the federal level that's going to produce more Polyevs. Like I mean, I think it would take an explicit root and branch effort to say we're going to do something dramatically different, mechanically, culturally, how we build, because I think that culture has taken over, and so I don't know that affection is as important a role as you say. Maybe they'd like to find someone that they has a greater sense of humor, who can do all that, but the culture is what it's going to be. I mean, this is part brosphere, this party right now, and so we'll have to see. But I wanted to talk about it for two reasons. One, I thought it was interesting that the National Post, the Post Media, who has had its nose so far up Pierre Poilievre's ass that it can almost smell the high karate that's been dabbled behind the ears of Andrew Scheer, that it decided that it was going to actually raise an objection. Okay. So, I mean, if you look at the coverage, people go, oh, Toronto Star is so liberal. And there is nothing like what's happened with Post Media over the last handful of years. Every motherfucking column, every single column throughout the entirety of December, January, February, March, April, May, just punishingly negative on the Liberals. Everything was wondrous with respect to Pierre Poilievre. So I thought it was interesting that you see like somebody raising their hand going, are we sure this cat is like the guy? But the second thing is, I don't think there's a tinker's chance in hell that any of this is going to happen. I think that he completely controls the caucus. I think he completely commands the architecture of the party. And I think people who have doubts are sensible enough to keep them to themselves. And I don't think there's much chance of this, for all the reasons that we've talked about.
Well, we're not all that sensible, I guess, Scott.
I know you've risen, but you have a lofty perch in Ontario where you have an independent power base. I think, if you're a backbench member of Parliament
Right.
in the Conservative caucus, there's no upside in you saying, let's kill the leader.
Yeah, I look, I think that's all true. I think the caucus, by design, through some of the candidate appointments that were made that were quite controversial, I think the decision around those was to put uber loyalists in safe ridings to buttress Poilievre's leadership. I think that was by design. I don't think that a leadership vote is going anywhere. I think Poilievre will be the leader going to the next election, no matter what. But I do think some of the advice that Jordan had, and that others have had, and that I think I've made as well, it has some merit. That having more of a team would be to his benefit. To have more people who you can point to and say it's going to be these people, not just me. And why would you do that? If you look at, like, I don't Nick Nanos had some numbers out in the past week. The other polling that I've been privy to would indicate the same. Poilievre's numbers have gotten worse since the election. And I think that's to your point, David. Like, there was a frustration with the Liberal government and its longevity. And I think two things are going on there. One, I think a lot of Conservatives like some of the things they're seeing from Carney. And the narrative for Poilievre is kind of like this karaoke Trump narrative of being a strong man and being inflexible and damn anyone who disagrees with me kind of approach. And they've been very heavy-handed, publicly and behind the scenes, within their own party with that approach. That only works when you win. That doesn't work when you lose. It does. It doesn't have the same ring. This inevitability and this sort of triumphalism that was demonstrated in all of their comms and approach before in the 2 years leading up to the election. After losing, if you come out and just gaslight everybody about how you actually really won and the rest, that is that makes you look weak and makes you look like a loser and makes you look stupid. And I don't think it's to their benefit. I think they'd be better to take a more traditional approach and try to broaden out the leadership team a bit and get some other faces in the window because they do exist. It's not like there aren't other competent people within that caucus that could play a larger role. But we've replaced only Polyev with now only Scheer, and I'm not sure that that's broadening the tent at all. I think that's just offering more of the same sort of smug unlikability. And I don't know. I guess we'll see what happens. But the notion that this was an anomalous election, look, there were a lot of things that were different about this election, but I think the next one will look more like this one than not, because I think it'll happen in all likelihood still within the context of a Trump presidency. If it's anything less than a full-term government, or there's a timing that makes sense for the Liberal Party, it's probably before Trump leaves. So I think you'll have that. And I don't think the NDP are going to be a factor in the next election. I'm not willing to write the NDP off forever. We've talked about that before. I think they've got strong roots at the provincial level, but I think the rebuilding effort that is required federally, the mountain of debt that they're struggling under, all of those things lead me to believe that they're not going to be much of a factor in the next election campaign. Certainly less of a factor than they were in this one, and they were almost non-existent in this one. Like, I just don't see how it can be any other way. Like, will they have any money to run a fully funded campaign? Probably not. What will their ability to attract candidates be? Worse than it was going into the last election. Like, all of those things mean that, the bar is being reset. You need 45 to 48% of the vote to have a chance of a majority government. It's just that simple. And it's probably more 48 if you're the conservatives, because they so overperform on the prairies. Like, they're going to need to do much better. So how are they going to broaden that electoral coalition? Is it by just saying, hey, we did everything right except, events, aligned against us in some unique way? Or do they need to actually have a bit of a rethink as to what their electoral coalition is and bring some of the people who voted Liberal back? And, signs right now are that situation's getting worse for them, not better.
Polyev hanging around with Scheer is like me surrounding myself with obese people, or Reid hanging around with people with a full head of their own hair. It is an obvious attempt to hide your own weaknesses and failings behind somebody who's even worse. All right, let's Jordan. You want to start with the Hey You?
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
I'm going to circle back to our earlier conversation about the G7, and I want to do a Hey You about Modi, because I think you guys were both very generous in your interpretation, so I will take the opposite position. So it's a Hey You to Carney and the team about inviting Modi to the G7. I think it is just a sour note in terms of a lot of the international moves that Carney has been making, many of which I think have been very smart and very strategic. This one feels a little bit more like a betrayal, I think, of Canadian values, and arguably maybe some of Mark Carney's values. And I think the reasons are pretty straightforward. We're not talking about a government that we just have, a trade disagreement with. We're talking about a government that very recently was involved in orchestrating a murder on Canadian soil. We're talking about a government that's been involved in intimidating Canadians. We're talking about a government that our own police force believes has been involved in electoral interference. And we're talking about a government that, with respect to all of these allegations, like, not only are they not, like, saying that they're denying involvement, they're saying they weren't involved, they're not cooperating with the investigation that Carney talks about that's ongoing. And that investigation is still ongoing. We don't yet have complete answers about what happened. And we're inviting their head of state to come to Canada to basically talk about our trade ties and talk about the business connections that we can have. And look, I understand that that's a very big economy that's very appealing for a lot of Canadian businesses. But there's a lot of other ways to signal a shift in that diplomatic relationship that do not involve inviting Modi to Canada and giving him that kind of a platform and that kind of a stature. And so I think for a guy whose motto has been that markets don't have values, people do, that this will be held up and found wanting.
Interesting. Thanks, Jordan. Scott?
Uh, well, my hey you sort of reaches way beyond Canadian politics. I just want to say I've been watching what's going on in the United States these last few days, and there's so much crazy that comes tumbling out of the Trump White House. There's so much that's objectionable that you do get immune to it. But my God, forget the National Guard being called in, which is terrifying in its own respect. But on June 2nd and June 3rd, these guys, these ICE agents, arrested 5,000 people in those 2 days. And the stories are legion. People in courthouses, their lawyers go to the bathroom and they grab a woman. These are men in everyday clothes with bandanas and kerchiefs over their face in order to hide their identity. Lawful agents authorized by the White House to just grab people and drag them into an elevator, and then they get deported to some fucking jail in El Salvador where there's no possibility of any kind of legal recourse, maybe torn away from their kids who were born here.
Why not just call them the Gestapo?
This is where I'm headed. So there's so many examples where we go, this is fascistic behavior. This is fascist conduct. And you go, Jesus, I don't want to be the guy who stands in the coffee lineup saying that Trump is a fascist and blah, blah, blah. Trump is a fascist. This is fascist conduct. This is a fucking secret police that is operating. And it was triggered last week, almost certainly because Trump didn't like the rhythm of daily media that was being produced by his spat with Elon. And so he thought, well, let's just amp up what's going on with ICE. Then, of course, the National Guard gets called in at his instigation. And voila, the Musk stuff dissipates. So, they're talking about building jails that can hold 100,000 people. And I just look at it and I think, my God, this is fascism, man. And when you have law firms that represented your political opponents are starved of federal work, and any of their clients who might have federal interests are told don't deal with those things, and so they fire their partners who might have carried those files, or they just shut them down altogether. Harvard University, if I dislike your policies and I don't like your tone that you take with me in objecting to this unbelievable incursion on your freedoms, it's fascism, man, and it's fucking frightening. And I don't know where it ends because nobody seems to have a pair of balls to stand up to this guy. That's all.
Well, it'd be tough to come by. It's a country now where people are afraid of their own government. So, Kory, got a hey you.
Yeah, I was going to talk about India, but I think we've talked about that one enough already. So maybe I'll shift to the new U.S. ambassador to Canada, who David, I think you and I got to go to a reception with him last week, and I'm going to offer some kind and I hopefully taken well advice. I say this as somebody who has not always managed relationships in his personal life like terribly well. Using the line "get over it," with your spouse or partner, I have had very limited success with that. And if you're going to go out and do your sort of initial media appearances to introduce yourself to the Canadian public as the new ambassador, to say that people need to just get over the 51st state comments is probably getting off on the wrong foot. We've been really fortunate, I think, to have had really strong ambassadors from Canada to the United States and vice versa from the US to Canada. And I really hope to wish the new ambassador well, but I think that's the wrong kind of introduction to make. And I think I would try to be in receive mode, not just transmit mode, a little bit more out of the gates, because I think there's an important role for diplomacy to play in these tariff negotiations and these other things. And hate to see somebody starting a job and getting hamstrung by making some ill-advised comments right out of the door.
Yeah, imagine working for Trump and thinking, well, my job in this relationship is to be the bad cop.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's what's required. I think there's enough bad cop in the market right now.
I've got a lighter hey you. My hey you goes out to former Ontario Premier David Peterson,
Oh man.
who was on my podcast, The Hurly Burly, this week. Maybe a long time ago for some of you, but feels like yesterday to me. And David Peterson back in 1985 did something that was up to that point thought impossible to do, and that was he defeated the PCs in an election campaign. They had won for 40 some consecutive years. By that point in time. And in so doing, he changed the nature of Ontario politics from a one-party system into a competitive regime, made the Liberals competitive in the cities for the first time. Quite a significant political figure in Canadian history. If you're at all interested, I've got a great conversation with him over on the Hurly Burly, and they're celebrating, of course, the 40th anniversary of their big win in 1985. So David Peterson, a hail fellow, well met if there ever was one. Here's to you.
It was such a beautiful pod, David. Like, that's where I cut my teeth. In the summer of 1989, I was working for the Peterson government. I just loved every syllable of it. And Peterson's every bit as charming and fun to listen to as ever. That was a fantastic, fantastic pod.
Right. All right. Well, thank the group of you for being here this morning. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsors, CN, Can Do, and TikTok Canada, and all of you accursed who watched or listened. Thanks for coming back this week, and we'll see you next Monday. Take care of yourselves.